Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I'm super excited to have you here today because we're doing a real deep dive. Think of this as an engineering postmortem on the actual nitty-gritty hardware realities of serving large language models in production. If you've been working in MLOps, or even just keeping tabs on the deployment of these newer models that pause to think, you definitely know that scaling test time compute is basically all the rage right now. But as we're going to see today, the theoretical math and the actual silicon reality are clashing hard. So let's just dive right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today's postmortem. We'll start with the deployment flops myth, then diagnose the attention bottleneck. After that, we'll break down the Kinetics Scaling Law, look at the 14B parameter threshold, and finally, we'll cover the sparse attention fix.
All right, part one, the deployment flops myth.
For the past year or so, the industry narrative has really been driven by this kind of flawed assumption about theoretical scaling. The idea sounded great, right? Compute flops are relatively cheap, so instead of serving these massive, unwieldy models, let's just deploy tiny ones and give them infinite thinking time, or test time compute, so they can rival the big frontier models. But the hardware reality? It's a totally different story. Down in the silicon, giving a small model infinite thinking time creates a massive memory gridlock. It stalls deployments, and frankly, it causes latency and costs to absolutely skyrocket.
The recent Kinetics research paper actually hit the nail on the head with this. They noted that prior scaling laws consistently overestimate the effectiveness of small models enhanced with inference time strategies. And as engineers, we really have to wake up to this reality. Small models are heavily penalized in production when you force them to do long reasoning tasks. But, why exactly is that happening?
Well, that brings us to Section 2, Diagnosing the Attention Bottleneck.
It really all comes down to KV cache memory access. You know the drill. During decoding, a model's self-attention layers constantly have to compute a weighted average of past values. That means loading massive key and value matrices from memory for every single token it generates. Think of your GPU's memory bandwidth like highway lanes. When a model kicks off a long chain of thought reasoning process, those highway lanes get completely, hopelessly jammed with KV cache traffic.
And guys, the scale of this gridlock is staggering. We are talking 100 to 1,000 times worse. When a model's generation length pushes past 4,096 tokens, which, let's be honest, is super common in deep reasoning or coding tasks now, the cost of that memory-bound attention surpasses the parameter-bound compute by a factor of 100 to 1,000. It's a metric researchers call the phi ratio. Basically, we're spending all our time just moving data around, not actually computing anything.
So that leaves us with a pretty massive engineering dilemma. How do we accurately measure true hardware cost when our memory bandwidth is completely gridlocked? Our standard way of measuring cost, flops, doesn't account for this memory traffic jam at all.
Which naturally leads us to Section 3, the Kinetics Scaling Law.
To actually measure this accurately, researchers introduced a new concept called eFLOPs, or equivalent flops. Think of this as a unified cost metric. It takes those brutal memory access costs we just talked about and scales them by the arithmetic intensity of your specific hardware. So for example, if you're running an NVIDIA H200 GPU, the arithmetic intensity is 562.5. When you factor that in, eFLOPs radically changes how we calculate inference costs. It finally gives us the true picture of the deployment burden. When you take that eFLOPs metric and map out optimal generation lengths across different model sizes, it completely exposes why those older assumptions were off. Factoring in memory bandwidth shows us that generating longer sequences on small models is just incredibly inefficient. The data clearly shows that small models hit a massive wall where generating more tokens just burns resources without giving you any proportional gains in quality.
Because here is the kicker. Small models carry a heavily disproportionate memory tax. Let me give you a stark example from the data. Take the QN 3.6B model. It's a tiny 1.2 gigabyte model, right? But it demands 3.5 gigabytes of KV cache just to store 32K tokens. The memory overhead is literally triple the size of the model itself. On the flip side, look at how LLMs scale. Doubling the model parameters results in only a 1.18x increase in KV cache size. Larger models are vastly more memory efficient per parameter.
Moving right along to Section 4, the 14B parameter threshold.
If we look at the optimal scaling strategies, specifically on the AMI Pareto frontier, a really clear, undeniable threshold emerges. A 14 billion parameter model just outright outperforms smaller 4B and 8B models, even when you give those smaller models massive amounts of test time compute. It proves that our computational resources are actually best spent scaling the model size up to this 14B threshold first, way before we ever start playing around with long reasoning chains. So let's lock in the rules for optimal resource allocation under this new Kinetics Scaling Law. Rule 1. Scale your base model parameters to that critical 14B threshold first. Rule 2. Avoid long chain of thought on sub-14B models, because as we saw, the memory tax is just too high. Rule 3. Only extend generation beyond 10K tokens once you cross that 14B line. And Rule 4. Initially allocate your budget to parameters over reasoning trials. In simple terms, scale your compute horsepower up to 14B before you try adding more highway lanes of generation length.
Finally, Section 5, the sparse attention fix.
Okay, so we know the new rules, but we are still ultimately boxed in by hardware memory. Knowing those constraints, how do we fundamentally re-architect our serving layer to truly unlock test time scaling for any model size?
Well, we basically have to change the math of attention itself. Traditional dense attention scales quadratically. Every new token makes the math exponentially harder, which leads to that extremely high bottlenecked memory access. But sparse attention, specifically a technique called block Top-K, turns that quadratic growth into sublinear scaling. It averages key vectors in blocks and simply skips the irrelevant tokens. This results in up to 10 times lower memory traffic and actually yields massive point gains on math benchmarks in low-cost setups. It's a total game changer.
And the throughput results are no joke. When you implement block Top-K Sparse Attention on something like H200 GPUs, you aren't just getting a small incremental bump. For smaller models generating long sequences, you can see up to a 25 times wall clock speedup. You literally shatter that KV cache traffic jam and restore the practical utility of smaller models.
So, pulling this all together, what's our final post-mortem recommendation for MLOps engineers? Here is your new deployment architecture playbook. Step 1. Scale your base model capacity to that 14B parameter threshold to maximize your parameter efficiency. Step 2. Implement block Top-K Sparse Attention in your serving layer to clear out those KV cache memory bottlenecks. And Step 3. Implement dynamic routing. You want to make sure you are only spending this expensive test time compute on complex queries that actually need it, instead of wasting memory bandwidth on simple questions.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with kind of a provocative thought. We've just seen that inference is completely dominated by data movement, not the actual math operations. So, do our upcoming silicon and hardware roadmaps need to fundamentally pivot away from chasing raw flops and focus almost entirely on memory bandwidth? It's a huge question, and honestly, it's one every hardware engineer is going to have to answer in this new age of test time scaling. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep optimizing those deployments.